Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Harold Holzer and Mr. Sam Waterston. Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States and Mrs. Laura Bush.
Mr. President, Mrs. Bush, of all the leaders who strode across the canvas of 19th century American history, no man was more frequently seen and more often heard than the man whose 196th birthday we mark tomorrow, Abraham Lincoln. In an age long before film, video, television, or the internet could flash instant images to the public, before photographs could even be reproduced in newspapers, Abraham Lincoln sat before primitive still cameras more often than nearly all of his contemporaries. Fully aware that these pictures could be copied and sold to supporters throughout the country, admirers who cherished carte de visite copies in their family albums, and viewed them through 3D stereopticon viewers, photos that were adapted by artists for painters that in turn inspired engravings. Lincoln once said he wanted to see and be seen. He started out as an unknown. He ended up as an icon. And in an age in which voices could not yet be amplified by microphones or loudspeakers, much less be taped or broadcast live, Lincoln barnstormed the country tirelessly to argue his views before the public, to debate his opponents, to address crowds in village squares, county fairgrounds, and college campuses. He began with a reputation as a jokester. He ended up, as Harriet Beecher Stowe and Walt Whitman agreed, the greatest writer among presidents, capable of great speeches on great occasions, of words and phrases that grace both American history and American literature. Lincoln, seen and heard. This afternoon, Sam Waterston and I propose to recreate the era in which it was still possible for the force of ideas and the power of the human face in repose to win admiration, adulation, and elections. The Lincoln era. What we found was a direct relationship between the Lincoln canon and the Lincoln image, between what he said and how we remember he looked. For in an age in which speech events themselves could not easily be photographed, Abraham Lincoln made sure to pose before the cameras just before or just after his greatest rhetorical triumphs, as if he wanted each of these milestone moments immortalized, not only verbally, but pictorially, not only in print, but in picture. By weaving together the words he spoke and the pictures each occasion inspired, we can reimagine the public man over a crucial 18-year span between his arrival in Congress in 1847 and his death in 1865, when words made a difference and pictures were still rare and precious commodities, emblematic of great moments and great individuals. The year is 1846. Abraham Lincoln has just been elected to the House of Representatives from Illinois. 4 years married, father of 2. He has escaped, for a time, the drudgery of the law and won a ticket to Washington. Before he leaves, he goes to the local Springfield photographer, Nicholas H. Shepard, to pose for this daguerreotype. It is the very first time he sits for the cameras. Maybe he's attracted by Shepard's ad in the local newspaper, offering a way to see ourselves as others see us, because Lincoln loves all the words of Robert Burns. So he dresses in a stiff new Sunday suit. His shirt collar is worn up high enough to conceal his long, scrawny neck, around which a long black tie is wrapped like a muffler. His hair, which usually stands in all directions, is slicked down and sleek, making his ears look even larger than usual. And his massive rail-splitter's hands are carefully posed to hold still during the long camera exposure. Soon he will leave for his one term in Congress, where he defies political prudence and speaks out against the Mexican War.
It is no easy thing to fight against a war. Some say Lincoln lost the chance to run for re-election because of his unwavering opposition. They were certain that each time he stood up in the House chamber to argue his views, he was committing slow but sure political suicide. But speak he did, again and again, sometimes with humor, sometimes with passion. This is what he says. July 27th, 1848. By the way, Mr. Speaker, did you know I am a military hero? Yes, sir, in the days of the Black Hawk War, I fought, bled, and came away. It is quite certain that I did not break my sword, for I had none to break, but I bent a musket pretty badly on one occasion. I had a good many bloody struggles with the mosquitoes, and although I never fainted from loss of blood, I can truly say I was often very hungry. January 12th, 1848. Now, sir, for the purpose of obtaining the very best evidence as to whether Texas had actually carried her revolution to the place where the hostilities of the present war commenced, let the President answer the interrogatories I proposed. Let him answer fully, fairly, and candidly. Let him answer with facts and not with arguments. Let him remember he sits where Washington sat, and so remembering, let him answer as Washington would answer. As a nation should not, and the Almighty will not be evaded, so let him attempt no evasion, no equivocation. And if so answering, he can show that the soil was ours, where the first blood of the war was shed, then I am with him for his justification. But if he cannot or will not do this, if on any pretense or no pretense he shall refuse or omit it, then I shall be fully convinced of what I more than suspect already, that he is deeply conscious of being in the wrong, that he feels the blood of this war, like the blood of Abel, is crying to heaven against him, that originally having some strong motive, he is trusting to escape scrutiny by fixing the public gaze upon the exceeding brightness of military glory, that attractive rainbow that rises in showers of blood, that serpent's eye that charms to destroy.
It is now October 1854. Lincoln has been out of politics for 6 years, replaced in Congress, back at work in the courts. But just a few weeks earlier, Congress passes the Kansas-Nebraska Act, nullifying the old Missouri Compromise that restricted slavery only to the South. And it arouses Lincoln, in his own words, as he has never been aroused before. On Friday, October 27th, he walks down a Chicago street with two fellow Republicans discussing the cause. When they pass the Lake Street gallery of a German-born daguerreotypist named Polycarpus von Schneidau, his friends talk Lincoln into posing, and this is the result. He wears a rumpled coat with a velvet lapel trim, an outlandish tie, and his hair, as he puts it, has a way of getting up as far as possible in the world. What he's holding is an anti-slavery newspaper for the cameras, as if to freeze in time the principles of his new party. Only a few days before, he had been in Peoria, where he provided the words that animate this picture.
First, Senator Stephen A. Douglas spoke for 3 hours. Then the crowd took a 2-hour recess to eat and drink. And finally, they returned to hear Lincoln speak for 3 hours more. Lincoln's eloquence that day, the local newspaper recalled, greatly impressed all his hearers. This is what he says. This declared indifference, but as I must think, covert real zeal for the spread of slavery, I cannot but hate. I hate it because of the monstrous injustice of slavery itself. I hate it because it deprives our Republican example of its just influence in the world, enables the enemies of free institutions with plausibility to taunt us as hypocrites, causes the real friends of freedom to doubt our sincerity, and especially because it forces so many really good men amongst ourselves into an open war with the very fundamental principles of civil liberty, criticizing the Declaration of Independence and insisting that there is no right principle of action but self-interest. The doctrine of self-government is right, absolutely and eternally right, but it has no just application as here attempted. Or perhaps I should rather say that whether it has such just application depends upon whether a Negro is not or is a man. If he is not a man, why, in that case, he who is a man may, as a matter of self-government, do just as he pleases with him. But if the Negro is a man, is it not to that extent a total destruction of self-government to say that he too shall not govern himself? When the white man governs himself, that is self-government. But when he governs himself and also governs another man, that is more than self-government. That is despotism. If the Negro is a man, why then my ancient faith teaches me that all men are created equal, and that there can be no moral right in connection with one man's making a slave of another. Let no one be deceived. The spirit of '76 and the spirit of Nebraska are utter antagonisms, and the former is rapidly being replaced by the latter.
In just 4 years, Lincoln is a candidate for the United States Senate, challenging Douglas face to face. Just a few days after the first of their 7 historic debates, he strolls into a Macomb, Illinois photo gallery to pose for this photograph. As always, it is a friend who urges Lincoln into the studio. He is not prepared. His collar is a bit too large for that long neck, and he sorely needs a haircut. Photographer T.B. Pearson offers his subject a mirror to check his appearance, but Lincoln refuses it. It would not be much of a likeness, he jokes, if I fixed up any. His close friend Joshua Speed might have been looking at this very image when he recalled, his face and forehead were wrinkled even in his youth. They deepened in age as streams their channels deeper wear. Generally, he was a very sad man, and his countenance indicated it.
But when he speaks, his face lights up with the inspiration of his ideas. And just a few weeks before he sits for this picture, he accepts the nomination for the Senate with a speech that invokes a biblical warning to predict the Civil War that was only 2 years away. This is what he says on June 16th, 1858. If we could first know where we are and whither we are tending, we could then better judge what to do and how to do it. We are now into the 5th year since a policy was initiated with the avowed object and confident promise of putting an end to slavery agitation. Under the operation of that policy, that agitation has not only not ceased, but has constantly augmented. In my opinion, it will not cease until a crisis shall have been reached and passed. A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. I do not expect the Union to be dissolved. I do not expect the House to fall. But I do expect it will cease to be divided. It will become all one thing or all the other. Either the opponents of slavery will arrest the further spread of it and place it where the public mind shall rest in the belief that it is in the course of ultimate extinction, or its advocates will push it forward till it shall become alike lawful in all the states, old as well as new, north as well as south.
The long season of Lincoln-Douglas debates is almost over. They began on a hot August afternoon in Ottawa, Illinois. They end on a frigid October afternoon in Alton. Campaigning in Pittsfield between debates on October 1st, Lincoln is asked by a friend named D.H. Gilmer to have his picture taken by the local photographer, Calvin Jackson. His hair is even longer than before. Does his grim expression mean that he knows he's destined to lose the Senate election, or is the fight still in him? One observer comments that his face is almost grotesquely square. He seems overwhelmed by melancholy. Even more so when he is photographed by William Judkins Thompson in Monmouth, Illinois, just 10 days later. But as a newspaper reporter marvels, when addressing an audience, the dull, listless features drop like a mask. The melancholy shadow disappears in a twinkle. The whole countenance is wreathed in animation. And never more so than when he ends the final debate in the town square of Alton.
The audience comes from all over. Steamboats offer $1 round-trip fares from St. Louis. The railroads provide discount tickets. The rest come by carriage or wagon or walk, 5,000 strong, filling the square. The whole arena, one eyewitness testified, was crowded with thousands of people for several blocks in front of the stand. At around 3 p.m., Lincoln rises for his final remarks, and this is what he says on October 15th, 1858. Douglas says that upon the score of equality, slaves should be allowed to go into new territory like other property. This is strictly logical if there is no difference between it and other property. That is the real issue. That is the issue that will continue in this country when these poor tongues of Judge Douglas and myself shall be silent. It is the eternal struggle between these two principles, right and wrong, throughout the world. They are the two principles that have stood face to face from the beginning of time and will ever continue to struggle. The one is the common right of humanity, and the other, the divine right of kings. It is the same principle in whatever shape it develops itself. It is the same spirit that says, you toil and work and earn bread, and I'll eat it. No matter in what shape it comes, whether from the mouth of a king who seeks to bestride the people of his own nation and live by the fruit of their labor, or from one race of men as an apology for enslaving another race, it is the same tyrannical principle.
His party squeaks by in the popular vote, but in those days the state legislature elects U.S. senators. not a direct vote of the people, so Lincoln loses. But he does emerge a national figure. The debates have made him famous. The pictures have made him familiar. The fight must go on, he writes a friend. Another explosion will soon come. And it does, just 2 years later in 1860. On February 27th, Lincoln travels all the way to New York City to deliver an eagerly awaited political speech at the Plymouth Church in Brooklyn. Promised a handsome honorarium, he buys a new suit for the occasion. But on the long, slow, bumpy train ride east, it grows dusty and rumpled. By the time he arrives, it clings to the contours of his unusual frame. His hosts have also neglected to tell him that they've moved his lecture to the Great Hall of the new Cooper Union in Manhattan. The newspapers have been alerted, and local Republicans are expecting fireworks. Lincoln feels the pressure. He spends the next morning in church, perhaps praying for success, and the rest of the day rewriting his oration. To memorialize the occasion, his confident hosts book a sitting with the city's preeminent photographer, Matthew Brady. Posing at his gallery on Broadway, Lincoln towers over the table that has been set up beside him as a prop. Brady moves toward Lincoln, piles some books on the table so his tall subject can touch them comfortably. Then he takes hold of Lincoln's shirt collar and tugs it up as high as he can. "I see, Mr. Brady," jokes Lincoln, "that you want to shorten my neck." "That's just so," Brady replies, and before the collar can sink down again, Brady exposes his glass plate. Brady will later boast that this picture became the means to Lincoln's election as president. Perhaps an exaggeration, but within months it will be copied by engravers and lithographers throughout the nation, introducing the once awkward subject for the first time as a dignified gentleman. And Lincoln by now himself understands the growing power of such images, though a presidential aspirant dare not admit it. All he would confess to an admirer who wrote to ask him for this picture: "I think you can easily get one at New York. While I was there, I was taken to one of the places where they get up such things, and I suppose they got my shadow and can multiply copies indefinitely." They did.
When he begins his speech that night in Cooper Union, his voice is strained and high-pitched, his accent hard to understand. Slowly, he unravels his arguments against the spread of slavery. Slowly, the audience begins falling under his spell. Lincoln writes to his wife that it went off passably well. But the formerly dubious New York Tribune declares no man ever before made such an impression on his first appeal to a New York audience, then as now the toughest audience on the planet. This is how he concludes that triumph. This is what he says on February 27th, 1860. "Let us be diverted by none of those sophistical contrivances wherewith we are so industriously plied and belabored. Contrivances such as groping for some middle ground between the right and the wrong, vain as the search for a man who should be neither a living man nor a dead man, such as a policy of don't care on the question about which all true men do care, such as union appeals beseeching true union men to yield to disunionists, reversing the divine rule and calling not the sinners but the righteous to repentance, such as invocations to Washington, imploring men to unsay what Washington said and undo what Washington did. Neither let us be slandered from our duty by false accusations against us, nor frightened from it by menaces of destruction to the government, nor of dungeons to ourselves. Let us have faith that right makes might, and in that faith, let us to the end dare to do our duty as we understand it."
Imagine a presidential campaign during which the candidate stays home and does no campaigning. It may sound archaic, it may sound irresistible, but it is true. Lincoln wins the nomination in May, and for the next 6 months stays out of the public spotlight as his surrogates seek votes in his name. He is photographed again and again, and the back porch strategy works. Though he wins only 39% of the vote that November, he wins a clear majority of the Electoral College, and with it, the White House. He poses for a photograph at home in Springfield. Then, in a series of new studio photos, beginning to grow whiskers for the first time in his life. 2 days after sitting for this photo, he is ready to leave Springfield for the last time in his life.
His friends and neighbors swarmed to the depot despite the rain, wanting the chance to say goodbye. Lincoln appears on the back platform of the rear car, a shawl wrapped around him, and lifts his hat. In one day, he will be 52 years old. He will never see this place again. This is what he says on February 11th, 1861. My friends, no one, not in my situation, can appreciate my feeling of sadness at this parting. To this place and the kindness of these people, I owe everything. Here I have lived a quarter of a century and have passed from a young to an old man. Here my children have been born, and one was buried. I now leave not knowing when or whether ever I may return, with a task before me greater than that which rested upon Washington. Without the assistance of that divine being who had ever attended him, I cannot succeed. With that assistance, I cannot fail. Trusting in him who can go with me and remain with you and be everywhere for good, let us confidently hope that all will yet be well. To his care commending you, as I hope in your prayers you will commend me, I bid you an affectionate farewell.
Lincoln begins the long railroad journey to Washington, pausing at station after station to greet well-wishers and assure them that he will do nothing to challenge slavery where it exists, nothing to threaten the South, nothing to incite them to dissolve the Union. But states begin to secede anyway, and crisis overtakes the journey. This is a new Lincoln, not only because he has won his first election in 14 years, but because he has grown that new beard. The old image, rail splitter, flatboatman, self-made man, has been supplanted by that of Father Abraham. Only one picture is taken along the exhausting 2-week journey. Outside Philadelphia's Independence Hall, where the president-elect is invited to raise the flag on Washington's birthday, February 22nd. He is barely visible on the flag-festooned platform, but there he is, holding his hat, waiting for his turn to speak. Children have climbed trees to get a better look, and a throng of admirers pushes forward to hear. And then he hoists the American flag.
He had been criticized for much of what he said during his inaugural journey, pleasantries and jokes designed to avoid controversy. But visiting the place where the country was born inspires him. This is what he says on February 22nd, 1861. I am filled with emotion at finding myself standing where were collected together the wisdom, the patriotism, the devotion to principle, from which sprang the institutions under which we live. I have never had a feeling politically that did not spring from the sentiments embodied in the Declaration of Independence. I have often pondered over the dangers which were incurred by the men who assembled here and adopted the Declaration. I have pondered over the toils that were endured by the officers and the soldiers of the Army who achieved that independence. I have often inquired of myself what great principle or idea it was that kept this Confederacy so long together. It was not the mere matter of the separation of the colonies from the motherland, but something in that declaration giving liberty not alone to the people of this country, but hope to the world for all future time. It was that which gave promise that in due time the weights should be lifted from the shoulders of all men, and that all should have an equal chance. Now, my friends, can this country be saved upon that basis? If it can, I will consider myself one of the happiest men in the world if I can help to save it. But if this country cannot be saved without giving up that principle, I was about to say, I would be rather assassinated on this spot than to surrender it.
He nearly is assassinated before he gets the chance to save the unhappy country. In Baltimore, he dons a disguise to pass through the city in secret and avoid a plot there to kill him. More threats surround him when he arrives the next morning in Washington. In response, he goes to have his picture taken. On February 24th, the young artist George H. Story answers a knock on the door of the little studio he rents in Matthew Brady's Washington photo galleries. Would he come to Brady's rooms and help pose the president-elect? When I entered the room, he remembered years later, the president was seated in a chair, wholly absorbed in deep thought. All I said in an undertone to the camera operator is, "Just bring your instrument here and take the picture." Story recalled him as elegant in dress and appearance, but he also wore that faraway look his friends knew all too well. He turns his head slightly to the camera, but he remains lost in a reverie of thought, perhaps recalling yesterday's and worrying about tomorrow's, obviously saddened by the thought of both. Then on March 4th, the photographers tried desperately to record the actual inauguration. A small camera was directly in front of Mr. Lincoln, a newspaper declares, another at a distance of 100 yards, and a third of huge dimension on the right, raised on a platform built specifically for the purpose. But this is the best that any of them can manage. A distant view of the throng ringing the Capitol. Somewhere at the center of the scene is the wooden canopy erected for the swearing in. Lincoln is the tallest man in the crowd of dignitaries, his starched new white shirt gleaming in the winter sun. In a moment, his old lifetime rival, the defeated opponent for the presidency, Stephen A. Douglas, will offer to take his hat and hold it during the inaugural address.
He writes it in a room above his brother-in-law's store on the town square in Springfield. He almost loses it during the trip to Washington when his son Robert misplaces it for a time, arousing a rare display of temper from his father. Lincoln knows it is the most important speech of his life. This is what he says at his inauguration on March 4th, 1861. Physically speaking, we cannot separate. We cannot remove our respective sections from each other, nor build an impassable wall between them. A husband and wife may be divorced and go out of the presence and beyond the reach of each other. But the different parts of our country cannot do this. They cannot but remain face to face. This country, with its institutions, belongs to the people who inhabit it. Why should there not be a patient confidence in the ultimate justice of the people? Is there any better or equal hope in the world? In your hands, my dissatisfied fellow countrymen, and not in mine, is the momentous issue of civil war. The government will not assail you. You have no conflict without yourselves being the aggressors. You have no oath registered in heaven to destroy the government, while I shall have the most solemn one to preserve, protect, and defend it. I am loath to close. We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection. The mystic cords of memory, stretching from every battlefield and patriot grave to every living heart and hearthstone, all over this broad land, will yet swell the chorus of the Union, when again touched, as surely they will be, by the better angels of our nature.
But the better angels of the national nature cannot prevent separation, rebellion, and bloodshed. Hope for quick suppression of the rebellion proves wildly optimistic. The squabble becomes an all-out war, and after a year and a half, Lincoln is a changed man, physically and politically, and ready to announce a changed policy. Throughout a lifetime of opposition to slavery, he has never threatened to defy the Constitution and destroy it in the states where it existed. Now, acting as commander-in-chief, he insists, and not as a humanitarian, he orders emancipation in 100 days unless the rebellion ends. This is how he looks, weighed down by care, yet occasionally captured almost candidly, almost spontaneously by a medium still constrained by Victorian formality and the technical limitations that required sitters to place their heads in neck immobilizers and hold their poses for a quarter of a minute without moving. Always an admirer remembered his thoughtful face was bent forward, as if thinking out some deep problems. Here, he may well be thinking of the titanic step he is about to take to change the war, change the country, and change us forever. And just this once, to consecrate the historic moment, he allows a photographer into his private office in the White House to take this picture, bad light notwithstanding, at the very table at which he had signed the Emancipation Proclamation. This is the closest Abraham Lincoln ever comes until that time to the ritual of the photo opportunity.
If my name ever goes into history, Lincoln said before signing the Emancipation Proclamation, it will be for this act. His hand is swollen and nearly paralyzed from handshaking. He does not want his signature to look tremulous, so he puts his pen down, massages his right hand with his left, and waits for the feeling to return. Only then does he put his name on the document that his critics call an invitation to race war, and his admirers call a second Declaration of Independence. The words themselves are legalistic, not inspiring, prose, not poetry. The only passion he dares summon to exalt the momentous occasion comes at the end. This is what he writes. Upon this act, sincerely believed to be an act of justice, warranted by the Constitution, upon military necessity, I invoke the considerate judgment of mankind and the gracious favor of Almighty God. To Congress, he explains in his annual message a few weeks later, "We cannot escape history. We will be remembered in spite of ourselves. No personal significance or insignificance can spare one or another of us. The fiery trial through which we pass will light us down in honor or dishonor to the latest generation. We shall nobly save or meanly lose the last best hope of earth."
He is celebrated by some and by others damned as the great emancipator. But he has yet to establish himself as a great commander-in-chief. Generals come, and just as quickly they go. Battlefield defeats and endless casualty lists in their wake. None is less like Lincoln than the man they call the Little Napoleon, George B. McClellan, a general who loves to drill but hates to fight. McClellan sees himself as the savior of the Union, and Lincoln as the original guerrilla. Lincoln could bear insult, but not inaction. So he journeys from Washington to the place where McClellan has moved his army, Antietam, and begs him to march and attack. McClellan organizes photo sessions and private conferences. These are the very first photographs of a commander-in-chief on a battlefield of war. But nothing comes of it. This is not the Army of the Potomac, Lincoln sadly concludes. It is McClellan's bodyguard.
Lincoln to McClellan, October 13th, 1862. You remember my speaking to you of what I called your overcautiousness? If we cannot beat the enemy where he is now, we never can, he again being within the entrenchments of Richmond. It is all easy if our troops march, and it is unmanly to say they cannot do it. McClellan to Lincoln, October 25th. I have in camp 267 horses. Of these, 128 are positively and absolutely unable to leave the camp from the following causes: sore tongue, grease, consequent lameness, and sore backs. The horses which are still around are absolutely broken down from fatigue. Lincoln to McClellan, October 25th. I have just read your dispatch about sore-tongued and fatigued horses. Will you pardon me for asking what the horses of your army have done since the Battle of Antietam that fatigue anything? McClellan tried to explain. Lincoln fired McClellan.
It is November 19th, 1863. The war's most awesome, costly, and crucial battle has been fought and won. Lincoln has been invited to give a few appropriate remarks on the battlefield in Pennsylvania. Not the main speech. That honor goes to a classical orator who would speak for 2 hours. Lincoln would speak for 2 minutes. First, he visited Alexander Gardner's photo studios in Washington for a series of portraits, looking confident in this souvenir for his 2 admiring private secretaries, and equally imposing in this famous close-up. A one-time critic observes, his appearance almost justified the jibes and jeers with which his enemies were accustomed to describe him. All but his eyes. Here his soul looked forth, piercing and searching, not to be deceived, practicing no guile. 11 days after posing for this picture, Lincoln reaches the zenith of American political oratory. With emancipation, he had changed the rationale for the war. Now he revolutionizes presidential speech-making. 272 words, most of one syllable, and perhaps, as some myths maintain, poorly received by the thousands who heard it on the scene. Democratic newspapers immediately attack it. The Republican press applauds it. Only one predicts it will live in the annals of the war. In fact, it lives well beyond. For it not only defines the war, but defines the soul of national existence. Only one photographer is able to take a picture, showing Lincoln in the distance, bareheaded on the speaker's stand at Gettysburg, minutes from immortality.
Fourscore-and-7 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation, or any nation so conceived and so dedicated, can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note or long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth.
A year after Gettysburg, he is reelected, the first president since Jackson to win a second term. Photographs show him more commanding than ever, posing for the Brady image that would inspire the portrait on the old $5 bills, as well as the photograph that more recently replaced it, posing for the profile later engraved for the copper penny, allowing a glimpse into his private life as he and his young son Tad share a book. By the spring of 1865, the Confederacy is in ruins, its starving armies trapped in Virginia, its government about to take flight. The end is near at last. Lincoln's last studio photographs by Gardner find him worn and emaciated, unable to erase what he calls his tired spot, yet for the first time in years, forcing a wan smile. A month later, he looks visibly annoyed at having to pose yet again, this time for a visiting Massachusetts photographer named Henry Warren, This was posed on the windy balcony of the White House. Finally, with victory inevitable, the government safe, all slaves everywhere about to be freed by constitutional amendment, but with a country littered with 1 million dead and wounded men, Abraham Lincoln returns to the U.S. Capitol, its inspiring new dome lighting the gray sky to deliver his second inaugural address. Photographer Alexander Gardner is in position yet again as the president takes his seat on the portico and waits his turn next to the lectern. Then, as Lincoln steps to the podium, gripping his 2-page speech and begins reading his last major address, Gardner takes this picture of the great man starring in the greatest of all American rituals. As the president speaks, the sun bursts through the clouds. An auspicious omen, one onlooker declares, sending an electric thrill through the crowd. Lincoln never again speaks to so large a crowd. Perhaps never before had he spoken such important words so magnificently. He calls it his best speech. I expect, he says, it will wear as well, perhaps better, than anything I have ever produced. Lincoln has served in the White House for 4 grueling years. The country had divided and is about to be reunited. 1 million soldiers are dead or wounded, but 3 million African-American slaves are finally free. Lincoln has less than 6 weeks to live. This is what he says.
If we shall suppose that American slavery is one of those offenses which in the providence of God must needs come, but which having continued through his appointed time, he now wills to remove, and that he gives to both North and South this terrible war as the woe due to those by whom the offense came. Shall we discern therein any departure from those divine attributes which the believers in a living God always ascribe to him? Fondly do we hope, fervently do we pray that this mighty scourge of war may speedily pass away. Yet if God wills that it continue until all the wealth piled by the bondman's 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, and until every drop of blood drawn with the lash shall be paid by another drawn with the sword, as was said 3,000 years ago, so still it must be said. The judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right, as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and a lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations.
By contemporaries who elected him, by admirers who elevated him to the realm of myth, and by a new millennium of Americans searching in words and pictures through the mystery of his life for inspiration to illuminate our future, as vividly recalled by these 2 determined, remarkably similar photographs taken 3 years and an eternity of experience apart. This is how Abraham Lincoln was and remains seen and heard. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you for that wonderful performance. Laura and I welcome you all to the White House. Appreciate the members of my cabinet who are here and former members of the cabinet who are here. I thank Senator Bill Frist for joining us, as well as Congressman Mel Watt. Thank you both for coming. Appreciate Michael Steele, the Lieutenant Governor of the great state of Maryland, for joining us. I want to thank Bruce Cole, the Chairman of the National Endowment for the Humanities. I appreciate Brian Lamb joining us today, the President and CEO of C-SPAN. I thank the U.S. Lincoln Bicentennial Commission members and the Advisory Committee for joining us today. Appreciate all the Lincoln scholars and authors who are here. Particularly appreciate Sam Waterston and Lynn and Graham for joining us, as well as Harold Holzer and Edith and Meg. Thank you all for coming. Sam and Harold have had a good many reviews since they first took Lincoln Seen and Heard on the road. Perhaps the most enthusiastic review I heard came from two unimpeachable sources, Mother and Dad, who told how much they enjoyed the performance when they saw it in Houston. Tonight we've had the special honor of listening to Lincoln's words being read in the very house where so many of them were written. Harold Holzer has written, co-authored, or edited 23 books on Lincoln and the Civil War. He co-chairs the U.S. Lincoln Bicentennial Commission, and in his spare time works for one of Laura's favorite museums, the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. He's an avid New York Yankee fan who had a miserable year last year. He has won many awards for his work, and his latest book is Lincoln at Cooper Union. This evening, I can let you all in on a secret. Tomorrow it will be announced that Alan Gelzo, who is with us tonight, and Harold Holzer are this year's first and second place winners of the prestigious Lincoln Prize. Congratulations. Those of you who know Sam Waterston as Jack McCoy should know that America's most famous assistant district attorney has portrayed Abraham Lincoln on stage, on television, and so I'm told, even in ballet. He didn't dance. But he did narrate a special version of Aaron Copland's Lincoln Portrait while ballet dancers performed around him. Sam has said, if I have to be typecast, I'd like to be typecast as Abraham Lincoln. I like a guy who aims high. In his readings tonight, Sam noted that it was on this very day back in 1861 that Abraham Lincoln said goodbye to his home in Springfield, Illinois, never to return. Over the next 4 years from this house, Lincoln would endure a bitter civil war that included terrible defeats as well as ringing victories. He'd sign the Emancipation Proclamation right upstairs, and he would live to see his hopes for peace and unity rewarded before his life was taken at Ford's Theater on Good Friday, 1865. The Civil War was decided on the battlefield. The larger fight for America's soul was waged with Lincoln's words. In his own day, Lincoln set himself squarely against a culture that held that some human beings were not intended by their Maker for freedom. And as president, he acted in the conviction that holding the Union together was the only way to hold America true to the founding promise of freedom and equality for all. And that is why, in my judgment, he was America's greatest president. We're familiar with the words of the Gettysburg Address in the Second Inaugural, so eloquently read by Sam. And this performance reminds us that Lincoln wrote his words to be spoken aloud, to persuade, to challenge, and to inspire. Abraham Lincoln was a master of the English language, but his true mother tongue was liberty. I hope that every American might have the experience we had here tonight, to hear Lincoln's words delivered with Lincoln's passion, and to leave with a greater appreciation for what these words of freedom mean in our own time. Thank you all again. Please join us at the reception, and may God continue to bless our great land.